Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nader, and I'm at the London Business School, as said. As you can tell by my first name, Nader, it's an anagram for a nerd, which means I'm going to have to focus on some psychological research that I've been engaged in, actually since my days at MIT. And so I'll focus on some of that, but also try to make some connections, obviously. The first connections I'd make, I took some notes from the earlier talks today. What I'm going to try to talk about are the world of ideas, or basically anything in terms of disruption. And I'm going to look at the counterpoint of this issue of being relevant versus non-relevant. Basically, do I fit your goals or do I not fit your goals? And it was interesting to see that the earlier speakers all kind of touched on this, and I'll bring in some of them later. But you know, Kevin this morning talked about understanding the goals of your employees as you being a stepping stone in a career, and how that can transform the way you go about your business and your success at attracting them. Seamus talked about how irrelevant some of these technologies are to the incumbents in an industry. And if you want to be disruptive, you have to think of literally the goals of the players operating in your space. Brian talked about the cargo bike, and what was the Achilles heel of that cargo bike, other than some of the glitches, was actually that when you had to make calls, they were not private, whereas the private booths allowed you that privacy. So one of the most important goals when making a phone call, especially about money, was not being met with those cargo bikes. Toby talked about the competition amongst goals, how the cool kids in the back, you're literally, standing in front of you, I'm competing with those cool kids in the back, and they're all wearing iPods, by the way. Tom talked really about this from a goal hierarchy standpoint, given Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he talked about how some goals, these goals are always there. We always care about safety, but some of them bubble up to the top based on certain events, for example, and they become more important. So in some sense, when we want to disrupt, we're competing for the activation of the goals that are kind of there in the background that you're always thinking about. Luke's talk was about understanding why kids are joining the gangs. Their goal was safety, going back to Maslow. And you had to provide them with an alternative solution to that problem. Okay? And, well, I'll end with Nuno here, but clearly he's a searcher in the most abstract sense for goals, for things that are interesting. And hopefully I can be somewhat interesting with my research as well. So here's an image, and kind of this research started with, as it often does, with the minutiae of everyday life. These are not my kids, but imagine kids watching TV, and I'm often on the road. I come back, and it's when you're on the road that you really miss your kids. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. So I come home, and I walk into the living room, and I announce proudly, "Papa's home." Now, I fantasize about this moment on the plane. They'd be rushing towards me, hugging me. But of course, because I don't bring presents when I come home, the reaction was just like that. They didn't move an inch. Okay? Now, I immediately thought there must be something wrong. Right? They must have some kind of inattention disorder. So I thought of some food supplements. You know? But before I thought of mixing them in with their morning cereal, I said, well, there are actually multiple alternatives here. Right? Either they were so absorbed by the TV that they didn't notice me. They actually were paying attention, just not to me. Okay? So they didn't notice me at all. Or they did notice me, but chose to ignore me. Okay? And you can see the consequences for them depends on which it is. So I decided to construct a simple test. Next time I came home, I didn't say, "Papa's home." Meow. And of course, in their minds, I was a cat. And they turned their heads. And there I thought I discovered it. The holy grail of marketing, disruption. You just have to lie. But turns out that they also immediately turned their head back after they saw me. And that, of course, goes back to our fundamental psychological mechanisms. We can attend all kinds of information in the environment, kind of your heaviness on your seat after lunch, the buzzing of the air conditioning, but we actually choose to attend certain other things. But the key thing is, it's not just that we only attend certain other things and everything else comes in, but we're actively blocking out the rest of the information. And that's called selective attention. And that's kind of the fundamental mechanism I want to focus on in this talk. And in doing so, I'll try to, well, this was my other trick, right? I tried it with woof. That didn't work either. They literally chose to ignore me. So they know it's Papa, and no matter what sound goes off now, they will continue watching TV. So I'm going to try to explain the behavior of my children. If I don't, I'll be blamed for it by my wife. I will try to do so by going to this fellow here. This is Phineas Gage. Some of you might have heard about him before. In 1848 in Vermont, in a mining accident, he was somebody who had this 1 meter iron tamping rod, and he was tamping down dynamite or sand on top of the dynamite. It exploded, shot through his jaw, through his head, landed about 100 meters down the road, and he survived. And I'll talk to you about that. That explains lots about our everyday shopping and sort of unintended consequences of the nuclear crisis in Japan. Okay? So I'll try to connect all those. I figured this is TED. I have to do something challenging. So here's a bombshell of a different type, though. And this is Marilyn Monroe. Now, let me ask you, this is participatory. Can I see a show of hands? Looking at these images, how many of you prefer image A in terms of attractiveness? Okay? Few people. How many of you prefer image B? Look around, right? The vast majority prefer image B. Why is that? This is because image B is her real image. And this is her mirror image. Okay? Now, which image would Marilyn have preferred? Turns out she prefers image A, because that's how she sees herself every day. And this is a concept called the mere exposure effect. The more often we see things, the more we like them. They become familiar. Okay? And here's the data. So if people are shown, this adds up to 100%. If they're shown either the mirror image or the actual image of their partners, assuming they love their partners, they prefer the actual image. Yet, when they look at their own photo, they prefer their mirror image. Now, this is not my research, and I've provided the reference below. Now, this goes back to the mere exposure effect, which Bob Zajonc came up with in 1968. He showed people supposedly subliminally these polygons. Later on, he showed them the polygons again, and another polygon that they hadn't seen before. They don't remember seeing any of these before, actually, but they tend to prefer, in a choice, well, they prefer this one, the one they had been exposed to before. So that's the mere exposure effect. If you Google it, mere exposure, there's about 180,000 hits today, so it's a very well-known phenomenon. And in advertising, we talk about any exposure being a good exposure. It's literally a truism. Okay? So I could take comfort in some sense in, well, my kids might not react to me, but at least I'm there. They see me, and they will love me for it. Well, there was some doubt. Is this really true? Okay? Now, I want to show you an advertisement, actually, but I'd also like you to follow the instructions. And I'll tell you now that the better you do at this test, it actually correlates with your intelligence. So I will quiz some of you later. So here we go.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Now, many of you will have thought, how could I have missed that? Well, it's because you're smart. So for those of you who saw it, you weren't focused enough. So this is like my children, right? They were focused on TV, while here you're focused on the passives and you actively blocked out everything. And that's the real question I have, is how do you feel about the bear when you see it again? And we'll come back to that. So if you see your children and they don't react to you, take comfort, they're smart. This is baby Einstein. Okay? Now, of course, they have a very clear goal in front of them. And I'm competing with in some sense with that goal. In a very subtle way, we try to test this experimentally, and we try to see, well, how is your perceptual mechanism operating when you're alone versus when somebody is there? And actually, somebody doesn't actually have to be in the room with you. You can just imagine them being in the room. So some of the results I show you, people weren't actually in the presence of somebody else. They just imagined somebody was in the room with them. And the first test, I gave them a precise goal. I said, tell me, as quickly as you can, this is a reaction time test, whether the word you're reading on the screen is a real word or a fake word, a scrambled word. And the goal we felt that would be activated if somebody else is in the room, especially of the opposite sex, which we always used, is the goal of social desirability. We have this goal to be socially desirable. So here, if we gave people words like paper that popped up, people were equally quick to recognize, yes, it's a real word, whether they were alone or with somebody else. Yet, when we gave them a word like pretty, they were much faster at recognizing it when somebody else was in the room. So in some sense, these goals are congruent. They work together. Also, in terms of memory, when we show them an advertisement like this, which relates to social desirability, when they imagine somebody in the room, they remembered this ad better. Now, we then said, well, how about a website like iVillage, when if you're a woman and you go to this internet for women, what does this do? It reminds you of your role as a woman in life. And if you see an ad for something like mascara, well, you should then remember it better. This is not a big effect, but all our theories tell us this is relevant to the goal I've activated, your goal as a woman. Now, what about a breast cancer ad? This is one of the major killers of women worldwide. Would we want to put a breast cancer ad if we had a media placement strategy on iVillage or something like the Discovery Channel? That was a question. I asked 40 advertising executives, and they all agreed, no, it has to be iVillage. It's relevant to women, and therefore we've activated that goal. But actually, when we studied, well, what if we activate your gender identity, breast cancer actually threatens you, the core of yourself. So what we're actually doing is we're putting up women's cognitive defenses. And if something threatening is shown, we're trying to ignore it. And this is exactly what happened. If you think about this as chance-level recognitions, did you recognize this yes or no? 50% would be chance. Only 33% of the women said they even remembered seeing this breast cancer ad. Also, when we did a similar activation of a woman's gender identity, and we asked women, are you at risk for breast cancer? They felt lower levels of risk compared to a control condition. And of course, risk perception drives behavior such as breast self-examination. So this has serious consequences. Also, in terms of actual donations, compared to other cancers, in a control condition, this is the only cancer relating to women, 80% would give to this form of cancer rather than skin cancer. Yet, when we activated their gender identity, less than half decided to give to ovarian cancer. So these have dramatic consequences in terms of goal activation. Now, the final study I want to show you is related to the feelings that might be involved here. And what we try to do is understand, well, if I see something, we have our emotional steering system attaches love or negative information to things we see. Do we like it, do we not? And it collects it in some sort of a bucket. And this then guides how we view it later. And it was this ability that Phineas lost by his frontal lobes being blown out. He could no longer think into the future. He would make a poor shopper in some sense. And I'll come back to that. And this is in addition to this mere exposure effect. So when we show people objects, we give them an arbitrary goal, like focus on this, and then we expose them to another object, and then we later on ask them to choose between the object they had selected and then the one that they were only exposed to for the same amount of time. Most of them selected this one. What happens to the one they ignored when they have to choose between one they didn't have to say this, not that? 50% more people chose this. They actually deselected this object. So if you're shopping and you're grabbing your favorite shampoo, the one next to it is actively being deselected. So if you think about brand differentiation, it's merely about choosing something that it differentiates the brand going forward. So to summarize it, if you think about sort of disruption, but in some sense, as Tom talked about, this noise in the environment, just by attracting attention, that can have negative consequences. Okay? And it gets back to these goals. You all know the answer to this question. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one. But the light bulb really wants to have to change. Okay? So if we don't fit our goals, if we don't better serve the operating goals, we're not going to disrupt. We're merely going to interrupt. If we want to disrupt, we first have to change people's goals. And a dramatic effect of that is the nuclear power accident in Japan. Now, we talked about Egypt. For 30 years, Mubarak was at the helm. Well, in Germany, the Green Party, for 30 years, has been having this anti-nuclear message. Yet it was only in the weeks after the election, after this nuclear crisis, that they became the leading party in the state of Baden-Württemberg, after 60 years of the conservatives being in power. So these goals and linking to people's goals is absolutely critical to disrupt. It's not only about the message we send, but it's in a sense about the recipient of that message. So thank you very much.